Welcome back, dear students, to yet another lecture on the history of English language and literature. We have discussed the life in the 60s, the life in the 70s, and in our lecture today, in our class today, we shall discuss the life in the 1980s. Life in the 1980s. And in England, the 80s were termed as a decade of Margaret Thatcher, the first woman Prime Minister of England, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was the leader of the Conservative Party from 1975 to 1990, and she was the first woman Prime Minister of England. She was the Prime Minister of United Kingdom from 1979 to 1990. Margaret Thatcher strongly opposed the socialist policies of the Labour Party, the socialist policies of the Labour Party. Now, one serious problem in the late 70s in England was the increasing power of trade unions. Under the Labour government, the power of the trade unions increased. Margaret Thatcher stopped this trend. A series of 4 legislative acts altered the position of the trade unions. Inflation and unemployment weakened the trade unions. The power of trade unions decreased considerably with the crushing of the miners' strike in 1984-85. The trade unions almost disappeared from the scene. That was a big achievement for Margaret Thatcher. The decline of the power of the trade unions meant that Britain no more favored the leftist political ideology. Conservative Party was ruling. We see a lot of privatization during the time of Margaret Thatcher. Privatization was another major policy of Thatcher government. This witnessed the dramatic shift from the public to the private sector. We have learned about the nationalization policies of the Labour government. The 2/3 of the state-owned commercial sector in 1979 was in the private hands by 1991-92 election. So, a lot of privatization, something opposed to nationalization. Property ownership. Thatcher government encouraged property ownership, private property ownership. The common man could buy flats. The common man could buy houses. Loans were made available to the salaried people to buy for themselves a home. So, private property, ownership of private property was allowed. The Conservative government under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher began to fight inflation. Inflation was a major problem in England. We have talked about inflation previously. Inflation refers to the rise in the prices of most goods and services of daily or common use. Goods like food, clothing, housing, recreation, transport, consumer staples, etc. So, containing the inflation was one of the main objectives of Thatcher's rule, and she would succeed. She would succeed and she would achieve prosperity. But the Thatcher's government is criticized for producing a sharp division between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. So, there is the division between the rich and the poor, a criticism that is leveled against Thatcher's government. Another important event that we must remember about the 1980s is the Falkland War. The Falkland War was an important event in the 80s, and we know Falkland is an island 350 miles east of Argentina and was part of the British Empire. Argentina invaded this island and Britain responded by sending troops, ships and planes to Falkland. There was severe fight in the air, fight in the sea, fight in the land with many casualties. At the end, Britain emerged victorious, but the number of people killed on both sides were greater than the population of Falkland. The war was criticized, but Thatcher won admiration for her brave stand. So, the Falkland War. We also see the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, the Princess of Wales. Diana was the Princess of Wales. Now, it was the biggest social event in the 1980s. Approximately 750 million people watched the event on television on 29 July 1981. The wedding day was a public holiday in Britain. One major criticism raised about the 1980s is that there was increase of crime and violence. increase of crime and violence. There was increase in the number of policemen. The punishments were more severe. Even though there was the increase in the number of policemen or the punishments were made very severe, yet the crimes continued to increase. Some sociologists have investigated the cause of this increase of crimes. Thatcher's government accused the permissiveness of the 60s as the cause for increase of violence. We know during the 60s the youth culture grew, the permissiveness grew, and that was the reason for the increase of violence in the 80s. That was the cause attributed to violence by Thatcher. But the opposition accused Thatcher and her values as a cause for violence. Margaret Thatcher gave more importance to individual than social responsibilities, more importance to individual than social responsibilities. And we see all the policies of the Thatcher government is termed as Thatcherism. It is called as Thatcherism. Thatcherism also created a materialistic attitude. The new generation had a lot of money and very little discipline. They were children of the youth of the 60s. Now, what was the reason? What was the cause for increase of violence? According to Thatcher's government, it was the result of the permissiveness of the youth culture of the 1960s. In the 1980s, the environment and the preservation of the environment was given more importance globally. Environmentalism, we have learned environmentalism. It is the conservation, preservation and the restoration of the environment. Environmentalism was growing popular globally. People see the need for preserving, people see the need for conserving, and people see the need for restoring the environment. In 1986, the world witnessed the Chernobyl disaster. Now, what is this Chernobyl disaster? It was the world's worst nuclear catastrophe. The disaster was caused in 1986 by a fire in Chernobyl in the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union, and many were affected by the adverse effects of radiation, not only in Ukraine but in other parts of the world as well. The effects of the environmental crisis was not restricted to the national borders. In the 1980s, the scientists began to talk about the damage done to the ozone layer. The discovery of the damage of the ozone layer also increased the concern for the environment. It was due to this rupture in the ozone layer was due to the commercial use of ozone depleting chemicals. The damage of the ozone layer allows the harmful ultraviolet rays of the sun to fall on the surface of the earth, and it will lead to increase in the cases of skin cancer. A pressing need to preserve the tropical rainforests of the world was recognized. Preserve the forests. People began to talk about the greenhouse effect. Now, what is the greenhouse effect? The greenhouse effect is a natural process that will warm the earth's surface. It's a process that will warm the earth's surface. When the sun's energy reaches the earth's atmosphere, some of it is reflected back to the space and the rest is absorbed and re-radiated to by greenhouse gases. Now, the greenhouse effect is caused by the atmospheric accumulation of gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, etc., which contain some of the heat emitted from Earth's surface. So there is people began to talk about greenhouse effect. Thus we see that the environment became a major concern during the 1980s. In the United States of America, Ronald Reagan was elected as the president. Now, Thatcher had a very special relationship with Reagan, which enabled her to reduce the tension between USA and USSR, to reduce the tension of the Cold War between USA and USSR. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, he became the leader in 1985 in USSR, in Soviet Union. The policies of the Gorbachev government led to the improvement in the East-West relationship. So, the efforts of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev reduced the tension between the East and the West, reduced the tension of the Cold War. Another negative adverse effect of the 1980s that the world witnessed was the killer AIDS. AIDS became a major issue, causing fear in the minds of people. Many believed that it was a punishment for a loose life, a life of decadence of the modern civilization. Actions were called forth for the control of this killer disease, AIDS. Now, some important novels of the 1980s were Rites of Passage by William Golding. There is Midnight's Children and Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. Some important American novelists like Philip Roth and Kurt Vonnegut also writes during this particular time. We also see some of the memorable films being screened. There is Gandhi by Richard Attenborough. There is E.T. by Steven Spielberg, and A Passage to India by David Lean. My dear students, we are concluding our lecture on the life in the 80s. As we said, the 80s witnessed great progress in science and technology. Remarkable growth of the computers and other electronic devices made life easy. On the other hand, there were major negative issues as well. The world was slowly realizing that the resources of the world are fast disappearing. If this continues in the given pace, the earth will turn out to be a planet unpleasant to live in. There was no contemplation of a third world war, as that would mean the end of the world. My dear students, as we come to the end of this lecture on the life in the 80s, for your assignment, please prepare a summary of the life in the 80s. Thank you for your patient listening. Please stay safe at home. Thank you. Have a nice time.